and inspiring us all. Our next speaker is Boston Consulting Group's Managing Director, Judith Wallenstein, and she is here in the participants. I turn over the floor now to you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Mark, can you hear me well?
I can, and I can see you as well.
Okay, so then let me face the next challenge, which is finding my presentation. So, but I think that should work. And thank you very much, everyone, for having me. What I thought, discussing with my colleagues, what could be interesting for you was give you a very brief snapshot of what we're currently discussing with a lot of CEOs across all industries. And I looked at that very much for Europe, because I'm heading our sustainability practice for Europe. But frankly, I don't feel that discussions across the globe are very different. And I think what we see that increasingly we have these discussions not only with a head of corporate affairs or a head of sustainability at our clients, but we have them with the CEO. And it's a serious topic. It's a topic that has risen to their agenda. They realize it's not cosmetic. So I thought I'd just take you through some of the analysis and some of the discussion points we also discussed with them, hoping that that also enriches your discussion that you're going to have. So how do we decarbonize a developed economy? And also how will investors think about it? Which I understand is also a topic of interest to many of you. I mean, you all know this picture in some shape and form, right? The tiny blip that the COVID crisis had brought us. You see in the red lines that, even with a number of the more ambitious CO2 emissions targets that governments have announced, we're nowhere close to a 1.5 degree or a 2-degree world. And that curve between 2025 and 2050 is becoming awfully steep. So, well, obviously, this is where this comes from, right? And I would just, when we look at the global greenhouse gas emissions, and these are the numbers of 2019, I would just like to draw your attention to the area of these squares. You see that, coal and power generation obviously still plays a huge role in emissions. But if you look at road, agriculture, iron and steel, you see these are big chunks that we have to tackle when we think about bending this curve and bending it very, very quickly. So the 1.5 to 2 degree world is getting awfully close. And you see that in the CO2 ppm concentration, the yellow curve. And frankly, the 1.5 world is not far away anymore. I would just like to draw your attention to this little picture you're seeing on the bottom right. That's my country, Germany. Germany is a very heavily affected country by global warming. Most people don't have that in mind a lot. And that has a lot to do with droughts, the impact on agricultural productivity. But you see that 1.5 degree world is a reality in my country already. And tipping points are getting close. And the important thing of these tipping points is that many of these will exacerbate the problem. If you start on the top, middle, and you look at the melting of the Arctic summer sea ice, this is getting very close, right? The melting of the permafrost to the right of that would require, obviously a different threshold, but it's also particularly dangerous. And if you look at the other ones, I mean, you already see that all of these, phenomena make our news more or less every single season and every single year. And, is that a problem? Of course, we all know it is. And what I've listed here is, yes, this threatens human civilization, but this is also awfully bad for our economy. If you look at the 1.5 degree Paris ambition, that actually means we live at a GDP level per capita that's roughly 8% below today. It also means that likely we're going to experience 2 months of droughts every year. So in a way, in any path, that's a given, right? If we look at a 2 degree Paris goal, we're already going to lose 13% of GDP, 4 months of droughts, and we reach some of those tipping points I've just showed you. And the current path is more a 4 degree plus path, which basically means you wipe a third of the world's GDP off. And also, if you look at poverty and development goals, you realize that that is becoming critical for big parts of the globe, including all of us. It also means over 10 months of droughts in many parts of the world. It means countries like Holland, cities like New York City or Miami flooded. It means food crises, wildfires abounding. So this is not a scenario that any of us would choose to live in. And, one of the points that, among all of this, I try to uphold, because optimism is not always easy in this, is investors are increasingly starting to care. And they're not only starting to care in some funky little green fund that they're putting up somewhere, but they're starting to care in a way that you could argue a good third of global assets under management today is in funds that do look at ESG metrics in the investment process. It's, of course, it's not perfect, a lot might still look better than it really is, but at least, that number's going up. And if you look at many of our private equity clients, for example, on funds that hold many portfolio companies, they're now looking very, very closely at a potential ESG risk that they are taking when they're investing. You also see that the green bond market, although of course still a niche market, has been growing very significantly, is now trending towards the 300 billion. And if you look at voting actions taken by entities like BlackRock against companies that fail to meet sustainability standards, you see that those become heavier weight and they become more. And yes, that's far from getting us to 1.5. I'd also like to be very clear about that. But it tells us that, investors do start to care about it. And I think it's a dynamic that we very much need to use. So, well, how do we get to net zero? And is that an unattainable goal? And I'd like to make the point, and that's a point we all believe very much in BCG. For some industries, this will be awfully difficult, but this is not, a trajectory that requires miracle technology. And it's also not going to be awfully difficult for everyone. So quickly, let's look at these five myths, right? Something you read in the media, you hear often. You also hear often from people who think we shouldn't, exaggerate on CO2 emissions reduction. We don't need a myriad of new technologies. We believe that more than 80% of greenhouse gas reduction will happen with proven and accepted technologies. It also doesn't mean we need to do something awfully dangerous, as people sometimes fear. Does it mean we need an all-electric society and power demand is going to go through the roof? No. Electrification is a big part of the solution when you think about mobility, but we don't believe that power demand overall is going to increase. Will that require a perfect green hydrogen economy, which we all know will not be easy to achieve in Europe? No. Also, let's keep in mind that hydrogen is no silver bullet, and we may really want to look at it for a number of industrial applications, and specifically in the hard-to-abate sectors that I'm going to touch upon in a moment. Does that require enormous, how do we deal with enormous excess power? Well, we actually think that there's grid expansion, trading, demand flexibilization will help us a lot to manage. And finally, there's always that debate, does it mean we're going to become over-dependent on other nations? The contrary is actually the case. If you look at it for many European nations, it means that energy imports are likely to decline, in some cases, such as Germany, by up to 70%. It also means, on the other hand, that the national energy autonomy is usually unachievable, which I don't think anyone from a European perspective would find surprising. So if you look at this is the technologies we already have in place today. Breakthroughs in photovoltaics, in green hydrogen, in carbon capture and storage are going to help open up new opportunities and help some of the very hard to abate sectors. Will this cost money? It is going to cost money. And you see that the 1.5 to 2.3 trillion, they are big and scary numbers. On the other hand, I'd like to remind all of us that now when governments had to deal with the COVID fallout and trying to keep the economy afloat in face of subsequent lockdowns, governments have spent a multiple of this amount of money. So if we're decisive enough, we can spend it. And we also have a particular idea of where that money should go. You know, I always am very passionate about the fact that the climate discussion shouldn't be a discussion on less and difficult and, you know, this will be, but no, this is also a growth story, an innovation story. If you go back to what I just showed you, that, you know, with unabated climate change, if it, you know, global warming keeps going uncontrolled, we risk losing a good third of the world's GDP. If you take a really conservative projection, you see that climate protection allows countries to keep GDP stable or even slightly increase it. That's now a scenario for a 2-degree path. And you can actually argue that behind the right-hand side, there is a big innovation agenda. That's also, by the way, one of the reasons why many of our clients are absolutely passionate about the topic today. And going back to investors again, you see that markets do reward investments into ESG performance, right? What you see here are some of the really hard to abate industries. And we've looked at the first quintile of, you know, comparable companies when it comes to emissions intensity. And we've looked at the stragglers, the fifth quintile. And actually you see that there is a real measurable difference in valuation. And the front runners in you know, emissions control usually do a lot better, while the fifth quintile gets punished over the median. And then, yes, we will need more radical measures. These are numbers, you know, that we very much used in the German policy environment. It means exiting coal 6 years earlier than it's currently planned. It means taking out CO2 from industry emissions 3 times faster than in the last 10 years. It would mean that by 2030, almost 90% of our new cars are electric cars, no combustion engines anymore. And if you believe that, you know, the average heating system that you put in your house will run for 25 years, and if we want to be net zero by 2050 on all of these, it means after 2025, neither for a renovation nor for a new build could you put in an oil or a gas heating, which in many countries is a real challenge. For a lot of industries that you see on the top of the slide, this is actually quite manageable when we think about the cost. For some, those at the bottom here, this is going to be awfully difficult. And this is also not going to work without regulation that, you know, helps these companies get through it. What often happens is that the economic risks attached to it are really overstated. What you see here, and again, these are European numbers on the left-hand side, you know, the share of emissions that come from cement, steel, base chemicals, aviation, and shipping. On the right-hand side, you see the share of GDP that these sectors represent. And also, you know, we've now looked at the industry, you know, by industry view. We also have to look, you know, very hard by industry along the entire supply chain. And I'm sure you're pretty familiar with the scope 1, 2, and 3 discussions. But if we look at those discussions, we see that the intensity of scope 3 discussions, you know, companies discussing this with their suppliers, looking at their travel, looking at some of their strategic partners and what they're doing when it comes to emission, has definitely intensified. What's also good to keep in mind is we don't have to look at everything at once. If you look at global emissions, nearly half of it comes from stuff we eat, stuff we live in, because we all know that construction is a real challenge, stuff we wear, you know, stuff we use every day in the sense of household goods, tech stuff. We all know the electronics supply chain challenge. And then everything that, you know, those of you who remember their childhood books would summarize as cars and trucks and things that go. And we see companies in all these sectors making huge efforts to first create transparency in their supply chain, and then move from transparency to really understanding how they fix it step by step. What we have to keep in mind that roughly 40% of emissions can actually be abated at very low cost. For some companies, this is even a cost savings case. Then there's another 40% that you can abate at some very reasonable costs, and where it gets awfully tough is on those last 20%. And obviously, you see that also differs by industry. What we've just done some recent work also with the World Economic Forum, and what I find really encouraging, we've been able to survey consumers for years, right? And they told us that obviously organic is important and green products are important, but that didn't necessarily mean that people were spending more money on these. Now we see that consumers are making these choices when we go deep into purchasing behaviors. And when we did that work across a number of industries, we also found that both from a manufacturer and also from a consumer perspective, there was real interest. The question we asked here was to say, look, is buying a net zero product a real competitive advantage? If you're a food producer, if you're a fashion designer, a construction company, or an electronics company, could you offer a net zero product, and would your customers pay for it? And what would it mean? Would it double the price of your smartphone? Would it triple the price of your car? And the answer is, if you take apart your jeans, an average 30,000 euro car, a food basket, or your smartphone, if you take that apart in all its components and you ask yourself how much more it would cost to produce a net zero product, you actually realize that we're not talking about unachievable amounts of money. It would be 500 euros for a car, €1 for a pair of jeans. It would be roughly €1 on a food basket and €3 on the smartphone. I'm not denying that this is going to cost money, but it also shows why a number of companies that are end consumer companies are looking to this with real interest, because they are looking at the question if consumers will make very deliberate choices, at a price premium that bigger parts of the population can afford. And then we see, what the types of measures are, and this is what I would like to close on, that companies are now taking already. First, on creating real transparency also with all their suppliers to create real accurate emission views, to optimize for CO2. And if you look at, how Tesla has redesigned cars to save weight, to extend battery reach, that obviously also helps on this front. Engaging suppliers very deeply to look at getting to net zero supply chains, and really, pushing the entire ecosystem to create net zero products. And then also, how do you enable your entire organization simply by training people on it, by creating skills that they have sustainability in mind as one of the elements that they absolutely have to optimize their innovation process for. So that was it very quickly, touching on a number of the topics that currently we discuss with a lot of our clients. I hope that helps to inspire your discussion, and that you have a fantastic evening.
Thank you very much, Judith. That was so wonderful. What a wonderful presentation with great numbers and understanding and explanation. Please have a wonderful evening. Thanks for your time.